All right, everyone. Welcome to week 2 of lower body training stuff. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, give a very brief summary of it here, but that would be good to listen to in order in sequence with what we're going to talk about today, because what we're going to talk about today are the specifics of lower body training. And last time we went over a lot of stuff from a principle-based standpoint, just on some general topics related to, how we can approach lower body training, some mistakes Ethan and I have sort of, made throughout our time lifting weights, and just, from a principle-based standpoint, the idea that when we select exercises for the lower body, but this also obviously applies to upper body to some extent as well. Um, Everything is ultimately going to come down to the identification of, the anatomy stuff, for starters, right? There's no way to really work around that roadblock of needing to just kind of understand where a muscle attaches, origin, insertion, that basic stuff, and then sort of what happens when the muscle contracts. Um, and then sort of in tandem with that, just what joint motions are created as a consequence of that specific contraction occurring. And then sort of as a level deeper than that, how we need to sort of load our bodies in order to train that, contraction quality. So, on our sort of first layer of principles, we discuss just anatomy and the force and the basics of those things, because, those two, in my experience at least, are the ones that oftentimes are, I think, assumed to be understood, just because we all have our own experiences and our own sensations during training. Everyone vaguely knows that, like, training your chest, you do something that looks like a press, and, training your back, you do something that looks like a pull down. But if you really want to be more specific and more precise, I think that understanding the anatomy and the force stuff at a level that's, worth explaining, and in a way that's a little bit more specific, can really drive you in the right direction insofar as just, making good selections for you, especially as your training evolves over time. And then the other two tiers that we sort of briefly touched on that we'll be more specific about in training specific lower body muscles today are just the factors related to stability, right? So with any, quote unquote good hypertrophy exercise, you want it to be stable enough just so that the tissue that you want to make a rate limiter of that motion is the rate limiter of the motion. It's the thing that starts and stops the range. It's the thing that fatigues most when you perform the motion and as you, fatigue in the context of a single set. And so stability after the anatomy and force stuff is kind of the second tier. And then the third tier is just sort of repeatability and standardization, right? So this kind of will come as a consequence, I think, of the first two layers. You don't want to be doing exercises that you can't repeat every week. You don't want to be doing exercises that, and sometimes this is unavoidable, but you don't want to be doing exercises that, as you scale the exercise and load, it becomes unfeasible to do for some reason, whether that's because of the stability factor or just some kind of discomfort factor. A lot of people on week 1 will start out doing an exercise and it's like, oh, this feels great, no problems. But then the second that load starts to escalate, maybe volume starts to escalate, you run into different issues. So you want to end up with exercises that you feel good about from an anatomy and a force perspective, that are stable, and then as a consequence of those things are repeatable and standardizable, if that's a word, over longer periods of time. So before we jump into quads, anything to kind of add that you feel like I maybe missed, just from a more general standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think that summarizes kind of like the bulk of what we're usually talking about when it comes to all things, anatomy, biomechanics. And then people will, usually hop in and have something to say about just what they find enjoyable, what they have available. So there's usually a lot of practical considerations. And, there's only so much we can talk about what a given person enjoys or what a given person finds, practical. But oftentimes, when someone's trying to make an argument for why they do one thing, that's often what it comes back to. So yeah, like we can generally just, put an umbrella over all of this stuff is you got to be excited about it, you got to enjoy it, you got to be able to work hard on it. But those are kind of givens for everything that we do, and not necessarily just like arguments that we can make for one specific thing when it comes to making general recommendations.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to bring up, because that it's funny as like a couple of posts that I made this week, that was the counter argument, which was like, well, this exercise might not make any sense mechanically, but like if you enjoy it, you know, like if it's serving the opposite goal that you're trying to achieve, but if you enjoy it, yeah, it's like that's totally fine, as long as you acknowledge the fact that it's not doing what you say it's doing. So yeah, it's good that I'm reminded of that though, at least because I'm someone, much like yourself, Ethan, who I don't really care about. Like, I just don't have a sense of enjoyment at this point. It's like it's all pretty much enjoyable to me, and the thing that increases the likelihood of something feeling enjoyable to me is if it's like in my head, if it's mechanically correct and if it makes sense according to the goal. But I realize that a lot of people who go into the gym who maybe don't have a specific goal or don't know how to be uber specific to accomplish a goal, I can understand why the concept of enjoyment would hold a higher priority. And I'm not bashing that, but I certainly don't think that the person who is currently listening to this is concerned about, novel enjoyment over long-term progress. So, but that's good that you are able to kind of pull me back a lot of the times when I get a little bit too narrowly focused, if you will. Um, okay, cool. So let's start with quads. I think everyone's favorite, I think, in terms of lower body stuff. And with each of these, I think just from a standpoint of addressing each one, I think it's worth considering that these are just to sort of follow suit with the conversation we just had. Exercises that, like to us, mechanically make sense, that are favorable for training the target tissue, that sort of go through those principle-based things that I just talked about, and sort of follow the X's and O's of those principles. And I think, we'll both have similar but also somewhat different insights just based on like um, the differences in our structure and your size and your strength, compared to mine or just the average person. Because something I find really interesting about your training specifically is just how surprising it can be, from the standpoint of like an expectation that I have about the way that it will look or feel, and then the reality of how it actually turns out when you add the amount of load that you can use. So I think that it's interesting to see what kinds of selections people are able to make at like lower levels of efficiency and lower levels of strength and hypertrophy, and then how that changes over time. Because I just think that like the more advanced that you get, the narrower that your selection window kind of has to become by necessity, just because you start to run into all these like different sorts of problems. So anyway, with the quad stuff, I think it'll be good to kind of go through each group through like the lengthened and shortened lens, but I also don't really think that's like super important from an outcome based standpoint. I usually just think that the lengthened shortened thing works itself out when you have enough exercises with the same um, group. So I think, everyone's favorite and maybe the most obvious one would be just to start with the leg extension and to kind of go through that. You have a very precise setup when it comes to leg extensions. Could you just kind of talk a little bit about the way that you set up a leg extension and maybe how it's different from just, sitting down on the machine and kicking your feet up like a toddler on a swing?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the first step would be, walking into a new gym, like how do I pick a leg
Yeah.
extension?
Yeah.
I'm fortunate enough that the gym I train in now, I think, has maybe 7 or 8 different leg extensions. So it is fun, to kind of like take a peek at each one and guess like, hey, I think this is going to fit me well. I like these features. And then you get in it, and to your point, maybe you discover something that you kind of overlooked. You didn't realize like, oh, I get more leverage here because of this. And it's a great way, when you have at least a little bit of knowledge, just getting in there and driving the car is a nice form of discovery as well. So some things that I look for, in a leg extension. One, it is helpful on both the leg extension and the seated leg curl, especially if you don't have a seat belt, as we'll talk about in a minute. If there's a little bit of a recline to the seat, so not just a back pad that's angled backwards, but the whole thing is tipped backwards.
Yeah, so like you're kind of like relaxing in like a beach chair, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. So gravity is forcing you back, into the sea, and that serves as a nice natural restraint. So that's not, an absolutely necessary feature. I would say like having a little bit of an angled back to the seat probably is a little bit more of a necessary feature, but you see that on almost every leg extension.
Hmm.
Um, from there, it's also my preference a lot of times that the shin pad, uh, many times having a little bit more of like a rounded shin pad will allow that point of application to be a little bit smoother. It depends on the machine, but just on average, something that has a very flat shin pad may contact you well at one point and not so well at another point. Um, that's also, going to be influenced by like the arc of the machine, which will be influenced both by if you're able to like adjust the height of the shin pad, um, you know, also like, how far forward you're placing the seat. So it's always like you move one thing and it kind of moves three more things. And that's where, someone who's been training a lot of times can get into a machine and just be like, "Ooh, this feels smooth," and it might be because it just doesn't hurt in any particular place. It might be their experience of where it feels heavy. So that's another component. It's like you or I might be able to look um, at a machine at the cam and say like, oh, that I can see the distance, the moment arm changing here, and I can see that it's getting a little maybe lighter at the top and heavier at the bottom. And I can also see sort of my leverage on the machine in terms of like how much force I'm able to sort of apply against that cam. And but you can also, like I mentioned, sort of feel that out, or you can just do a set to failure and see like how many reps in the lengthened position can I do at the end of the set. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of the set, I really do like the seatbelt as well. As we're moving through any arc, there's a horizontal component and a more like vertical component. And moving through this like horizontal component of the arc, we have this back pad uh, behind us, um, and we're able to push back into the seat. We're able to push down into the pad underneath us. But to really move through that vertical arc at the end, I find it really helpful instead of pulling yourself down into the seat to actually push through the seatbelt. And just anecdotally, I've seen a lot more reps when people are cued that way with the seatbelt. So we kind of went through, a lot of things in no particular order, ranging from the restraint of either this entire seat being tipped backwards, like you mentioned, like a beach chair, to the seatbelt, which offers a similar restraint, to the adjustability of the machine. Can you move the shin pad? Can you move the starting position of the shin pad in terms of how much knee flexion you're in? Obviously, most back pads, are adjustable forward to back, and then finally the profile of the machine, which is not just the cam, but the cam will play a large influence on that.
Yeah, so I think you brought up some good things there in terms of just like sequence of events, because a lot of times the way that you order a setup on a machine can really change your experience with it. And I think that, like you implied, it's important to kind of go through one thing at a time. And it's important to kind of start with the things that are maybe more influential in terms of just their total effect on the exercise. And this is something that I thought was really funny a couple of times when you and I were in Oklahoma and we were with Tom Purvis, where Tom would go through like this whole process of setting someone up in a machine. And then the person, like just like on their own started to adjust the seat. And he's like, don't you dare like move that seat because that's going to change everything. So I think it's important to start from the where you did, which was like the seat, and get comfy in the seat and make sure that it's a position that makes sense in terms of just like, there's the obvious constraint where you want your tibia and your shin hanging off of the pad, but you obviously don't want to be a foot forward where now all of a sudden your knee is like half a foot in front of the axis too. So I think a good starting point is like to just sit down and be like, if I just did this leg extension with no pad on me, would this make sense based on where I'm sitting? And then from there, you go to the pad, and then you ask, okay, is this pad in a spot that is relatively comfortable? And then from there, you start to look at execution and things like stability with the anchoring thing. I think a good general starting point with the pad stuff and the pad positioning is just like somewhere on the bottom half of the shin. I find that with just comfort, the shape of people's tibia and the ridges that they have on the front of the shin can make it different in terms of where comfort is. Some people only feel comfortable with pads that are lower. Some people only feel comfortable having pads that are maybe slightly higher up or somewhere in between. So there's no right or wrong in terms of like where the pad should be. But I just think that finding that comfortable spot and making sure that if you're using like a flat pad, that the pad doesn't feel like it's shifting as you're going through the range. If the pad is cylindrical, like the ones that you describe that are sort of more rounded, those pads can kind of roll and the friction doesn't get super uncomfortable in many cases. But if you have one that's like totally flat, like a rectangle, you don't want to feel like as you're going through the range of motion that it's like trying to move your skin or your shin hairs in either direction. So yeah, seat generally reclining good. Pad second in terms of where it starts and then where it maybe goes, and then just securing yourself down. If you have a seatbelt, that's great. Another method maybe that's can be a little bit more convenient if people are unwilling to go through the process of purchasing a seatbelt, kind of looking like an idiot in a public gym and all that stuff. Or if you just find it uncomfortable at your hips, which can happen depending on how thin the strap you have is, you can just take like straps that you use for pull downs and stuff, and you can just strap your hands to the handles instead of going through the seatbelt thing. It won't be as directly stable as using a seatbelt, but it's probably better than having to pull yourself down into the seat the whole time. And that can be a good sort of alternative for people that want to just make the execution a little bit more seamless. And the other thing that I'll add there too is don't feel like you have to if it's hard to manage two legs or if you have discrepancies between legs. Don't feel like you have to do it two legs at the same time. Single leg is also an option. And because you'll likely be lifting half of the load or less than half of the load, depending on the machine, doing it single leg can be a good way to just get execution down if it's something you're struggling with. You don't have to focus on two legs at the same time. And the load is much lighter, so it's easier to hold yourself down uh, in some ways. So, in terms of like execution and stuff, any like general cues that you have in mind insofar as like the bottom and the top and how that changes that you keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, whether it be for me or a client, one way I'll have a sense of if we've set the thing up right is if I'm seeing their knees move out of a single plane the whole time. So, I want the knees more or less pointed, giving the appearance of pointing straight forward, almost like two headlights. And, if those headlights are shifting, sort of moving side to side throughout, like at the bottom, maybe they're, pointed inwards, and then at the top, they're pointed outwards. I might cue the person, whether in the initial setup, to kind of, we'll use the cue sometimes of like wrap your hamstring adductor complex, kind of underneath, like basically
Mm.
laterally, um, to sort of just like stick yourself to the seat and keep those headlights pointed straight forward. Or some people just simply aren't, aware of the relevance of that, and they're just, trying to make, being thoughtless and trying to make it easy. We'll see this on like the lying leg curl too. Um, and that, like we mentioned before, that can also be augmented by the setup. It may simply just be that uh, the shin pad could be in a better position, or the seat could be a little bit further back or further forward, or we could recline them a little bit more. So some things on that note, like there are people where maybe the machine is just like in a little bit too much hip flexion for them, and maybe I'll put like an angled back pad behind them to allow them to lean back a little bit further. I find that in some cases, again, to almost be like an additional restraint that allows them to move, to go through the last reps in a way where they're failing, um, not through the partials at the end, but they're failing at the very top of the rep. So in other words, they seem to get a little bit better profile sometimes if they lean back. That may have something to do with like the length of the rack fem being a little bit more stretched there. It may have something to do with, again, the additional restraint of being more reclined. It may be that the machine is, set up in such a way to begin with that they're just in greater amount of hip flexion than they can get into passively, and maybe their back's a little rounded. Um, but that's an option too, either just like having a pad behind you to be able to lean back a little bit more, or even a pad underneath you that's angled downwards that also decreases that hip flexion angle. And as far as the seatbelt goes, the seatbelt is meant as a restraint mainly for that top half of the motion. So the seatbelt's not coming from behind you, it's coming from underneath you. And the seatbelt's not sitting on your quads in a way that's like really occluding you. It's more so like on your hips, like, as if you had a belt on, but, coming from right underneath you. So again, in regards to execution, knees are more or less pointed forward, but that doesn't mean that the feet are necessarily pointed forward. I'll kind of let the feet go where they may. Um, and then, this will apply to any exercise, but I think like the leg extension is just a really good place to get used to that local muscular fatigue. And it's a really excellent place to just practice like staying in a rhythm, dealing with that local discomfort while, not changing your position, not losing the like your bracing and your anchoring throughout. And all the other concepts of like controlling the eccentric, being able to, pause and control the transition from eccentric to concentric, and just, really being able to grind out those final reps without any real risk, when it comes to, the rest of your body, in terms of like if you're doing a squat and you're maybe worried about your back, going to failure, or even like just the systemic fatigue of how it's going to influence the rest of your exercises. So very many times when I'm trying to teach someone to get really good at dealing with local muscular fatigue and just being able to sort of like maintain that almost like meditative quality where you're like aware of the fact that it's incredibly uncomfortable, but you're just kind of keeping your hand in the fire and getting used to the fact that like, look, eventually your quads aren't going to be able to, produce enough force to overcome this machine, and you'll stop. You won't be able to knee extend anymore. That might end with a few partials, that might end with a really slow couple of grinding reps to the very top. But either way, you just get used to the fact like, hey, there's nothing to worry about here. Like eventually your knees will just stop moving and we'll move about our day and everything will be fine. That's where I like to teach that concept, because I think we've all experienced just like how how different that acute and local fatigue is in the leg extension compared to like just about anything else.
Yeah, that's such an important, you said so many important things there, like to just in terms of contextualizing training as a whole. This morning I was actually like writing, just writing some stuff for the newsletter, and I was writing just on the topic of the functional movement. And you know, for anyone that's not familiar with the functional movement, it's basically like a philosophy, if you can call it that, that is predicated on the assumption that you need to basically be doing exercises that look like they're compound exercises, multi-joint things that often involve very little support, like a single leg free weight hinge, or even something like a barbell, back squat or split squat or something. And what you lose by, especially for beginners, what you lose by starting from that kind of place is you lose the ability to really gain a skill in those specific avenues that you mentioned, which is just like not really panicking under fatigue. And it kind of goes hand in hand that the less structural support that you have around you, the fewer anchors, fewer restraints that you have around you, the more likely it is that you're going to be in some kind of like higher danger situation, not having any of that around you. So it is really interesting for me to see people coming from backgrounds that are heavily influenced by functional movement type things or CrossFit or just powerlifting, where so much of the exercise selection is done without any kind of external support. And you often see those people get into those quote isolation based things just completely with no ability to really work into fatigue, because what they know is like, if I start to get into fatigue, now I'm in a dangerous place. So I actually think that all of the functional movement arguments work again, like they sort of eat their own tails in a sense, because um, for beginners especially, that kind of thing becomes more important because beginners don't understand that skill of being able to fatigue without just total panic and total redistribution of stress and those kinds of things. So that's super relevant to pretty much every exercise, but specifically lower body stuff too, because that's lower body fatigue is definitely of a different kind, but you certainly see that anywhere. Um, so yeah, and then the one other thing I wanted to touch on just in terms of cues is to your point earlier about how, with a leg extension, the motion of a leg extension is, an arc, as most movements are. Most machines, or a lot of machines, aren't, but with leg extensions, leg curls, preacher curls, those kinds of things, you're moving in an arc. So, your intent in one portion of the range should be very different from your intent in another portion of the range. And even if you're talking about something like a leg press or a hack squat, which we'll talk about next, the intent from beginning to end should change at some point. So there shouldn't be, a single cue that you use, at least initially, learning a motion, because you need to kind of get a sense of like where your direction is changing within the confines of the motion. So, in this example at the bottom, it's like your foot moves forward, but then it literally moves 90 degrees differently at the top. So sort of forward at the bottom and up at the top. And then all the restraint stuff that we kind of talked about earlier, follows suit to that. So so I don't want to give maybe that much context to all the other things that we're going to talk about, because we'll be here for 5 hours. But I think we can kind of refer back to this example and all the others in the context of those. That makes sense. So kind of moving on to some of the other options, the lower body pressing stuff. I want to kind of put like hack squat, pendulum squat, maybe leg press, all in a sort of similar bucket. Um, in terms of like lower body pressing, although those can be different, I think that all those have similar qualities, in that you get a lot more involvement of the hips and, in some cases, the spine. As compared to the leg extension. So the leg extension starts us really just focus on the quads, but then any hack squat, any pendulum squat, or any leg press will start to involve, more of that hip extension component. So just kind of starting with like the hack squats and the pendulum squats, you have your option, at least in the hack squat, to sort of backload, where the pad is behind the lower back, or, some of the mid back. And then you have that kinds of hack squats that are just shoulder pads and also have a back pad. I know that you've obviously used both. I've used both. From a starting point, though, do you have any thoughts just on like preference for one of them over the other, in terms of like loading from the shoulders versus loading from, the spine more directly? Do you have a preference now? And then if you do, does that sort of impact, client selections, and just I'm interested to kind of see where you go with that concept.
Yeah, since we're talking about quads, I would have to say, all things being equal in the sense that we're just talking about like a healthy person here, I would lean towards the one that's loaded at the shoulders, so actually, more axially loaded. And that's just simply because we're not starting in as much hip flexion. And that's likely to allow us to get more knee flexion.
Yeah. So, and then in your specific context, I mean, you do a combination. You've used a combination, obviously.
I recently went back to the one that's loaded on the shoulders, but it's more just a timeline thing.
Yeah.
Like it was what, 2021, midway through the year when I was working with Stu, through like, September, October. So call it 2020, no, sorry, 2023, I guess that I would have, been sort of like fully rehabbed and back to training. And just knowing what I was dealing with in terms of like the compressive injury to my spine and just how long that takes to heal. Just some of the bone injury, like to the end plate, that's a long, long healing process. So that's something that I really wanted to titrate up slowly. And one of the decisions I made there was just to walk away from things like, putting a bar across my shoulders, pendulum squat, hack squat. And I started with things that looked more like a leg press or the hack squat you're describing that's loaded more at the low back and hips. Um, but, aside from that, I would say most of the time, you know, when just in isolation, if we're not looking at the rest of the entire program and saying, all right, how much spine load are we dealing with here? I still like the idea of starting in a little bit less hip flexion if we're trying to really maximize the stimulus on the quads. But you have to again take it in context of your other exercises. So when I was doing that, I still had a split squat in the program or a lunge in the program. So it's all just like how does everything kind of fit together. And a lot of times, as you alluded to, we're double dipping, and it's just like, okay, this isn't just a quad exercise, we're also pretty good adductor exercise, pretty good glute exercise. So there are some things that we're looking to be a little bit more general, and some things we're looking to really get the most out of one particular muscle group. And even the order plays into that as well. Did I just like do a bunch of leg extensions to failure and then immediately go into this hack squat or pendulum squat where maybe my quads really end up being the limiter in a really constrained exercise like that. That all plays into it. But currently, for my quad training, I'm doing a leg extension. I'm doing a leg press that has a little bit of an arc to it with a really reclined back pad, feet pretty low on the leg press. So going through a good amount of hip flexion and a good amount of knee extension or knee flexion, both in my leg press and in my hack squat. And probably the major difference as far as loading between the two is there's an arc to the leg press that I'm using. And also again, just like in terms of in terms of like differentiating other stresses, for me and my injury history, I think the hack squat is just a little bit more cost for me to pay spine wise, so I put that last in my program when I've already, fatigue. I've already done leg extensions. I've already done adductor, abductor, already done some leg curls, so it's like everything's kind of fatigued a bit in isolation by the time I get there. It's the last exercise. I need to use the least amount of load, but it's also the most systemically fatiguing exercise. So when I leave the gym, I don't have to worry about, um, that hack squat fatiguing, the calf raises I'm about to do afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So just from just to step back for a second in terms of just like the lower body pressing stuff for quads, I think it's a decent rule of thumb to be like, pick the stance that feels like you can get a decent amount of depth comfortably. I think that's as general as I'm willing to kind of go with it. There's no necessary right or wrong with the hack squat leg press stuff in terms of, you know, how wide you put your feet, although I err on the side of like not too wide and not too narrow, kind of striking the middle, something that you would naturally assume. And then just, not necessarily aiming to just arbitrarily go as deep as possible, but as deep as you feel like you can sort of quote, keep it in your quads. I especially find that with motions like hack squats, where people sort of get introduced to quad training now by hearing things like go as deep as possible, drive the knees forward, which is all, it's not necessarily bad, but it oftentimes, especially in those end range positions, leaves people to basically just be super passive with where they're at in the bottom of the motion, sort of getting smushed rather than controlling. So I would almost say, like, if you are struggling to, uh, connect with quads on like lower body pressing motions, don't be afraid to reduce the range to the amount that feels like you can really just powerfully control consistently. Like, even if that means, going to a knee angle where your hamstrings are not touching your calves, like that's totally fine. And it might be better as a starting point for you to then just sort of over time be able to work down to a greater degree of depth if that's comfortable. I definitely see many people just assuming that they should go to the bottom immediately. And I don't think that's, a harmful narrative, but I just would be cautious about assuming that you have to be at a certain point in terms of knee over toe or in terms of knee bend, just overall. And obviously there's, stuff to consider at the spine with that too, that, we've talked about in previous episodes with just like, the whole butt wink thing. So if people want to maybe learn more about that, they can go to that episode, which was however many episodes ago now.
Uh,
Um, yeah, go
one
ahead.
thing, one thing that I'll ask people to do when maybe they've asked me to take a look, at their pendulum squat or hack squat or what have you, and I'm wondering if this is something that you find useful or maybe have a counter to, is, if I see them, especially on the pendulum squat, if I see them just kind of dropping into the bottom, just kind of letting that sort of, rotational inertia of the machine just like push them and smush them into the bottom, I'll just ask them, hey, can you stop it for me at the bottom? Can you just show me that you can stop it just for a split second? Can you show me that you can hold it there for a second? And whether or not do that in every rep going forward, just show me that you can stop it and hold it there, with muscular control. Is that something in an exercise like that you find to be a useful proxy or cue?
Yeah, for sure. And that was something I used a lot in powerlifting programs, especially for like just technical error toward the bottom. Obviously this is in the context of powerlifting, there's likely to be some breakdown when you're pushing 105, 110% of like, your old max or whatever. But especially for hypertrophy training, there are no things that you have to be tied to in terms of like range or execution. So if someone only felt good like using those pauses long term, I wouldn't be against people just using pauses, really forever. But especially in the initial phases of like teaching and teaching control, that's something I found that's really helpful. And to sort of dovetail off of that, I would also say that I find that useful um, in a position that is sort of like equal and opposite. So rather than people pausing toward the bottom or close to it, I'll make sure that people can stop close to the top. Because that is something that, at the top of, let's say, like a hack squat, for example, people can rest there, but I think the importance of using a strategy like pausing closer to the top but not locking is just that concept of being able to actually maintain control over the weight. Because, when people get into like relaxing at the top of anything, whether it's a squat or a leg press or a dumbbell press, usually the technique will deviate out of that position to some degree, unless you're like hyper constrained, even in a pendulum squat. So yeah, I like to kind of apply that to both ends as well. And I think that's, we kind of see a similar theme here with just like initially tr initially trying not to worry too much about the extremes, because the extremes tend to be where people lose control or just lose a sense of like awareness of their bodies, for totally different reasons, or maybe you could argue similar reasons in terms of just like a relaxation concept. Um, but especially in the example of like a leg extension, um, being okay with not using the bottom 10% and the top 10% kind of keeps people in that groove where, they're accumulating a good amount of work, quote, time under tension, right? Where just they're controlling the motion with the muscle. I do find that that's an underrated strategy, is just to reduce the range to something that is totally, just a totally competent zone. And like I said, that usually just ends up being somewhere in the middle for a number of different reasons. The main of which is just like there's not a ton of change of direction in that sort of middle zone of any of the joints. Um, so yeah, absolutely. Um, so so in terms of like hack squats, setup is pretty straightforward other than, just other than what we described. Um, we'll cover maybe leg press. Well, we could talk about leg press now too. I feel we won't necessarily double dip with the glute adductor stuff with leg press again. But in general, I would say a lot of leg presses end up putting people at a super high hip flexion angle, meaning that like, you know, if you picture, the extreme version of this is like the vertical leg press, where people are lying on their backs and their feet are like above their fucking head. But a lot of leg presses, even if they're like 45 degrees, have a foot plate that's not super long. So you end up having to kind of put your feet somewhere like at your eye level or your chin level. And I think a couple of strategies to kind of help out with that is, you could put something underneath of the seat that you're using, as long as you're able to still sort of hold yourself into the seat. That's a good option. You could just move your feet as low as possible. That's another decent option. But I think that, especially with an increased amount of discussion around like biasing different muscles, I would rather someone get into a leg press and have them use less range at the knee in a position where they're much more stable and confident, uh, as opposed to like doing the sissy style leg press where they're getting an extreme amount of knee bend, right? Although the sissy style where their feet are like, for those of you who don't know, it's like a sissy style is when you put your feet super low and just kind of the balls of your feet are on the platform. If you're not super comfortable with a normal leg press, I wouldn't just jump straight into that. Just because again, sort of playing the extremes, it might be a good idea to start somewhere in the middle. And once you get really confident with your ability to like control your spine, control the load with substantial loads with a flat foot and with a degree of effort that you can call at least close to failure, I think then you can start to play around at the extremes of like super quad biased, super hip biased. But I think there's nothing wrong with just sort of striking the middle, because just because of the constraints of all these machines, hack squat, pendulum squat, leg press. These are what we can categorize, or what Tom calls constrained, close chains. So regardless essentially of the amount of knee bend, the amount of hip bend, where your feet are, the angle of your feet, right? Your quads and your hips have to move the foot plate forward, right? So it doesn't matter how quad biased the motion is, you're always going to have some glutes and some adductors. No matter how hip biased it is, you're going to have some quads. So I think in terms of leg pressing, my general bit of advice would be strike the middle where it's comfortable, whether or not it feels like more or less quad or glute. I would not worry too much about. I would just be more concerned with learning the skill of lower body pressing, and then sort of working more into an extreme if you feel that it's like something that's missing in your program or something that may add additional um, benefit. So anything else you wanted to say just on the lower body pressing thing? We didn't really cover yet the free weight options. You mentioned like split squat and a lunge. Um, those I would say in general, before I hand it to you, I do find that a lot of people underestimate how complicated those motions can be for people to do. It's like a lot of people, I see a lot of trainers on day one just like giving their clients walking lunges. And that's not something I can't say I would never do that, because I'm sure I'll find a time where, where I would. But I think the much like the leg extension concept we talked about, and just how, um, restricting movement to sort of only do one thing can be helpful. I think especially with any single leg motion, the degree of complexity relative to something like a leg press, even if the leg press is single leg, is much more scaled because of how many different ways you can fuck up the movement. So I do think that split squats and lunges have their place, but what do you kind of think of that, and just those like free weight kind of squat type motions in general?
Mhm. Some things that come to mind again are just coming back to the idea of like exercise order and like what you really want to be the limiter. There may be an instance where it's just like I want to be most efficient on time, and I want to hit everything to a high degree. And I pick like maybe a free weight squat, and you're just like bang out a bunch of sets of that. And it's like, yeah, you kind of throw a grenade out there, get a lot of everything, good amount of fatigue, good amount of stimulus, relatively spread out depending on, your individual sort of anatomical idiosyncrasies. Um, but you may find, like myself, that maybe you want to limit the stress on your spine, or you may be a person who wants to limit the stress on your knees. And you found, for example, like you mentioned, Ben, maybe the single leg stuff is a little bit more, stressful on the knees, doing like a deep knee bend, split squat, lunge, etc. So maybe you can tolerate it for a couple sets, at the end of a program, just in terms of the amount of load you need to use, or even just the fact that maybe at the end of the program, like you're okay with the idea of sort of slowing things down and really focusing on like the qualitative aspect, and you're not coming in so gung ho, like most weight, make yourself feel really fatigued. It may be, a similar sort of situation with the pendulum squat, now where we're dealing with an arcing motion where there's more going on than just dealing with a straight up and down leg press, hack squat. A lot of people will also find with that in time that the knees, may bug them a little bit because there's just a lot of considerations as far as, setting up for something like that. So yeah, just in terms of exercise order based on like what's your injury history, like what's the focus for the day in terms of what muscles you're trying to train. I think that's all super relevant when it comes to just leg pressing, hack squat, sort of like squatting motions in general. I mean, look, looking through that lens of low back pain, that's probably where I see like those two things are probably where I see some of the most issues in terms of like the leg press I've always found, pretty easy to stabilize in. Like I'm someone whose head looks like they're going to explode when they're in a really, constrained and really anchored machine like that. Like I know how to generate a tremendous amount of just internal pressure, pulling down on the handles, pulling my ass down into the seat, and for me, it was more just like the total volume of that shit that I did over time, total weight used, frequency of training. And eventually, like, anything can become a poison if you do too much of it. But I will see very many people like that come to me and say, I have pain with the leg press. And when I watch them do that, they're really trying to exaggerate the range and they're getting a lot of the butt wink at the bottom. And again, whether you believe that's important or not, anecdotally, when you remove that, a lot of people will feel better. And that's like a relatively common thing that I'll see. So yeah, just off the top of the dome, that's kind of sums it up for me with those two categories of things.
Yeah, and the other thing I didn't mention in the context of the free weight stuff is just like, if I'm gonna do like a barbell squat, almost every time I'm gonna find something to put underneath of my heels. It's very rare to find someone that doesn't end up, helping. So just kind of as a caveat, I don't want to get too in depth on that one point, but I think that's relevant. And then the other thing that you mentioned about like the potential problems we can see with the single leg stuff. I think an important point to make there is this concept that what you see as the net loading is not equivalent to the net force on a joint. So, for example, many people will assume that because they can do 5 plates on either side of the leg press, that then doing a body weight, you know, forward lunge or doing a body weight split squat with super far knee travel is going to be less force on their knee, when in many cases it ends up not being the case. Now, so like are we going to sit down and am I able to do that calculation? No, but I do know that number one, body weight plays a humongous role. Things like landing forces and impact forces with a walking lunge play a huge role, especially on the knee stuff. And then just overall, like your ability to, and I briefly mentioned this last week, but like your ability to really smush yourself down into a joint, specifically the knee joint, is much higher in the context of like what feels like a lot less external loading. So you could, in those cases, even though you're maybe just using body weight or a couple dumbbells, you could have as much or more force on the knee. Don't be confused by the fact that you have a lot of plates on a leg extension. Force is not the same as motion, and force is not the same between scenarios. You can't really make that comparison because there's also the whole distance thing, the torque thing, and how that plays a role. So yeah, so just don't underestimate the complexity of the single leg stuff. And then in tandem with that, the last thing I wanted to say before we move on to hamstrings is just this concept of just to sort of touch on it again. Um, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the term bias in the context of leg press because I think it leads people to believe that you can turn a totally constrained motion into something that is substantially biased. But my experience tells me that if you're going to any degree of substantial fatigue in a leg press or a hack squat or a pendulum squat where your feet are fully on the platform, you're always going to have some knee stuff. You're always going to have some hip stuff. So there's no way around that. And that's important to me because I find that a lot of people are now being introduced to these concepts to begin with through this lens of like the whole biasing thing. And it's a very like sexy trap to kind of fall for. But just understanding that there's no such thing ultimately as a complete bias in a leg press, especially under fatigue. Your brain is going to kind of use hip, your brain is going to use knee, especially when one or the other, muscle group is fatigued. So leg pressing, you can lump under quads, but you by necessity under glutes and stuff as well. And then the only difference between, pendulum squats relative to the other two or three that we were talking about is just pendulum squats by their nature, the way the motion arcs will be, more in the direction of knee stuff. And the total linear hip thing or the total linear leg press thing will be more in the direction relative to the pendulum squat in terms of involving hip, but both involve both. Okay. Okay, so that was quads. I think that was pretty well covered. So in terms of hamstrings, I look at hamstrings as like you got three major buckets. You got your seated leg curls, you got your lying leg curls, and then you got your straighter knee hinges. And so that's kind of how I group those different guys together. Um, just in terms of like leg curl setup stuff, I think we can kind of mirror our discussion of the leg extension in a number of ways. Just in terms of seated leg curls, for now, can you just kind of talk through like how you set that up in terms of how it mirrors or how it's different from the leg extension stuff?
Yeah, so starting with the same place, we have that reclined back pad or the entire machine that's tipped back a little bit ideally. We've set the seat belt now to actually be in a little bit more of like a vertical or a horizontal direction. So with the leg extension, the very difficult position of getting short or getting fully knee extended is what we're trying to augment with the seat belt as we shove upwards into it. The seatbelt on the seated leg curl is still coming, from underneath us to a degree, but it's also coming from behind us so that we can shove forward as we're finishing into the very knee flexed or short hamstring position there. So, um, in this case, instead of pulling up on the handles underneath me, I'm pushing into the handles in front of me and I'm driving through the seatbelt, and that's just going to allow me to get the most amount of anchoring to be able to finish in the short position. Whereas in the lengthened position, I have this thigh pad shoving down on me. I shove back up into it, and that gives me good anchoring for the first or more vertical part of that motion. We have, ideally the same thing going on, at that shin pad or sort of calf pad in this instance, where, ideally there's some adjustability there, but it's not 100% necessary. Um, Same thing, goes for profile. I know you and I have been doing some assisted stuff with that recently, which works out. I think that's a little bit easier than like assisting the profile on a leg extension, because you can use your body weight to assist it there, or your partner can at least. Um, so yeah, I mean, as far as setup, so many things, like you said, just sort of mirror what we're looking at in the leg extension as far as how far forward, how far back do we want the seat? it's very common for me to see people have the seat really far forward with their knee considerably in front of the axis, and then also not have the thigh pad, or the pad just above the knee on very tight at all, and just uh, watch their thigh move throughout the range of motion, and never really be able to get short unless they give the appearance of that by lifting their hips. Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of just like high level overview of what it looks like for me getting into the seated leg curl. And as I mentioned with the leg press, I think the more weight you need to move, the more you really appreciate this idea of increasing the blood pressure to 100 out of 100 and driving into every inch of all of those pads. Even with my thighs, it's 32 plus inches. Like when I push the thigh pad down, it's basically at the bottom of where the machine allows. So I'm really, really smushing my thighs down, which allows me to shove up hard. I'm tightening the seatbelt as hard as I can. I'm pushing the bars in front of me to the point where they start to squeak a little bit. And there's not an inch of margin that, I'm not shoving into that machine.
Yeah, and that's such an important point broadly that just seems, at least for me, in terms of like just exploring different stuff, more creative stuff, investigating quote new concepts, is just this idea that in order for motion to occur anywhere in any context, not just human movement, there needs to be something that is immovable off of which that motion occurs, And like in the context of walking, it's like that's the ground. In the context of exercise, um we see what happens, by the way, when like you and I were talking about this recently, like when there's snow or when the ground is icy, just not having the floor to push off of is like that's such a clear example of you having to sort of penguin slide, or at least I have to penguin slide. I don't know what you do, like on top of ice. So I think that it'll continue to be a theme that we talk about with just all the anchoring stuff, but I really do find that, like you're saying, that does end up clearing up so many of the different like issues and fallouts that we see in execution. Is just focusing more on the stuff that is not supposed to move and focusing on where pressure should be going. It's something like a leg curl up into the thigh pad or the seat or whatever. The only thing, so you covered pretty much everything there. The only thing I would add is just the hip angle thing. A lot of people now are sort of leaning forward and they're doing this like slumping over the leg curl machine thing. I always advise just like a neutral or a slightly extended spine position. That's kind of how the hamstrings are gonna function best, especially for the goal of the exercise. You don't want to be tucking your pelvis underneath of you like a dog taking a shit or anything. That's just going to move you farther away from the goal. So just not being super gung ho on the whole, like trying to lean forward as much as you can thing. Like it's not only from a muscle perspective is it going to be a little weaker, but it's also going to put you in a position where you're not able to push against the back pad as much. It might put you in a position where you start to lose contact because you lose contact with the thigh pad because you're sort of leaning forward and backward, those kinds of things. So I would just generally advise making sure that you're smushing back into the seat, like you mentioned, and usually spine position can kind of work itself out from there. And if you're someone who has a lot of hip flexion range, even with a more knee extended position or knee straight position, you can simply just sort of move the seat up and shimmy yourself around in the seat to find that spot where you can actually drive into the seat. And if you had to determine the trade-off of like, okay, I could be twice as stable or I could have 2 degrees more hip flexion, I would choose the stability component and the counter force component over that little bit of extra length, that you may get in theory. So lying leg curl, I mean, not too much really else I would say to consider other than just those fundamental things. I would say the biggest difference, obviously, if you're doing it prone or standing, I know you do a standing one, but if you're doing it prone, just really making sure that the bottom portion of your quads, the portion that is smushed by a thigh pad on a seated leg curl, just making sure that doesn't lose contact with the pad that you're on, and making sure that you don't lose control of the handles in your hands, because that's essentially, your other sort of support. So Using the hands in the lying leg curl is kind of the equivalent of using the back pad and your hands sort of pushing forward in the seated leg curl. So just making sure that you don't lose focus on your upper body is especially important with that guy. Anything in the context of the standing curl that you would add to that? Because I haven't really used many of those machines. I'm not sure what differences there might be.
I mean, it's a very similar angle as far as the pads. Obviously, you don't have gravity, pushing you down into the pads, but I still grab the handles, which are positioned the same as they would be, for a lying leg curl. Just imagine that prone position now being flipped upright. The handles are still in the same position.
Mm,
Pads are still at a very similar angle of hip flexion. So I'm still pulling myself into the pads. I'm still shoving my thigh, forward into the pad in front of me. And I think really the concept that resonates a lot with that one is what you were saying with the leg extension, is that I'm just kind of staying in the middle of that arc. It's just like you find that groove and you live there. And I think you'll see that with a lot of, successful bodybuilders is they just kind of tend to stay in a groove. It's like, oh, this is where I get the best, pump. And it's just rhythmic. They're
mm,
just in, from 10% to 90% and just kind of like just grooving back and forth. And you can almost watch it and it feels like you can you can almost feel yourself getting pumped when you watch someone stay in that rhythm. Because it's just like watching, it's literally like watching a mechanical pump
mm,
where there's just no deviation. It's just super consistent. You see it contract and expand and contract and expand. And it's like you can close your eyes and you can listen to it and it sounds like that, right? Like that kind of rhythm and just, not deviating from the position, I think is something just as in terms of all the things that get you to that place, probably encompass a lot of things that are a net benefit.
mm,
There are probably a lot of things, whether it's the anchoring concept, whether it's just like staying in a certain part of the arc that you can control really well, whether it's just that constant like occlusion the whole time, like whatever it is, like there are probably a number of components that just like when you watch good bodybuilders train, they have that rhythmic sort of pumping action to things.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, so you mentioned seated leg curl, the whole leaning forward thing, and it's like, who really has that much hip flexion anyway? Like you watch someone lay down on their back and do a leg raise. No one's bringing their legs to their chest anyway. So you got to think, where's that motion mostly coming from? And maybe it's the first time they really did um, sort of tighten everything up and create a degree of restraint. Maybe that's the only way they've sort of learned how to do it, because now they're like gripping the shit out of the handles on the front. Maybe they're shoving their butt backwards, whatever it is. Like it may, like a lot of times, bad setup, you'll see like decrease the load people can use, and they'll say, oh, I'm going through more range. And I'm not sure, like I haven't tried it myself, but I wouldn't be surprised if like their output doesn't go down tremendously, just because it's the first time they've ever really like used some degree of anchoring. But if they learned how to do that in a position that was, more sort of leverage, for the hamstrings, and was, you know, not moving like a pelvis and a spine as much as they are, like I think they would get even more output.
mhm,
So you kind of get one concept, but maybe like miss a couple others. So it looks like a net benefit when it could actually be a little bit better if they incorporated that same concept elsewhere. The lying leg curl, something that like a lot of people seem to struggle with as far as like getting the motion from the knee joint versus like moving at the pelvis and spine. And one thing that you had mentioned before was like much like using the seatbelt and shoving into it versus not having the seatbelt and shoving down into say like a leg extension or a seated leg curl. If we don't have the seated leg curl, we shove down so that we don't get pulled up. But if we have the seatbelt, we might shove into it because we can't get pulled up any further. And you had mentioned with the lying leg curl, maybe just going into a little bit of lumbar extension there and sort of setting that position to start. And again, finding the groove that way. where if you're able to place more pressure sort of closer to the knee, and you're able to lock your pelvis in place and then have the additional anchoring by pulling on the handles, those might be like the points of contact that really allow you to just stay in that groove. And maybe you don't go much like, the preacher curl. For a lot of people, maybe it's just staying on the very bottom and what they perceive to be the very top of that motion. So I think this one in particular, like, really lends itself to sort of staying in the 80% of the range versus, what they perceive to be the very top of their heel, touching the pad touching their butt, or the machine sort of bottoming out with, the plates hitting each other. This is probably like, one of the better examples of where people will find a good groove in the middle.
Yeah, especially just because like on most lying leg curls, I found that to use an amount of load that's appropriate for that last like 10 or 20% means dropping the load that you were to use in the rest of the range by like a substantial margin. So it wouldn't be that going there would be bad or whatever. It would just be, you would just have to be aware of that, just that mechanical reality of just the top end, those that last little bit being so much weaker. Um, yeah, and the one other thing I'll add to that is that aside from the length and the position changes, the seated leg curl I find is a little bit more intuitive because you can actually see your knees and like you can see what's happening. And the prone, you literally can't. So just make sure that in general, like when you're lying down on a prone curl, that you're actually paying attention to like how your thighs, start to lay down, how you lay yourself down on the pads because. If you just sort of haphazardly lay down, your feet could be way bowed out and your knees might not be at all set up well for the direction the pad is moving. So I always try to get people to sort of like lie down first and then just briefly, like we talking about the leg extension, just briefly sort of pick up the thighs and like put them down again to make sure that there's no like friction, going on the front side of the thighs with your clothes or with your quads. And then also so that when you actually move through the range of a curl, your foot is basically just moving parallel to, the femur, right? You don't want it going way out to the side, inward or outward. So just kind of checking that range beforehand is important on the lying, and then on the seated, just making sure that your shin caps are, roughly pointed, or your kneecaps are roughly pointed toward the ceiling is not a good or not a bad starting point rather. So kind of like similar similar example in the leg extension like you mentioned is just to have your kneecaps kind of pointed toward the sky. Same exact thing, in a seated leg curl, kneecaps kind of toward the ceiling or toward the sky. um, Now, in terms of the straight-legged or stiffer leg hinges, I don't necessarily see a problem with with a dumbbell, straight leg hinge or a barbell straight leg hinge, but I do find that like the amount of range of motion that people have into a hinge with a straight knee or a straighter knee is so much less than people like realize. People end up just bending their knees as they're going down, or they just get a ton of motion through the spine. So you and I use the hyper extension that we have, which is the Atlantis one. It's the best one on the market, I think, for sure, at least that I've seen, just because it can adjust in so many ways. Um, in terms of like straight-legged hinges, I personally find like I'm biased at this point toward, if I have like someone who I'm working with online and they're just having a lot of trouble executing a straight knee hinge, I have no problem really with like just doing extra sets of leg curls. I don't think it's a huge deal, especially if they can just, execute the leg curls with a lot more ease and accuracy. And just to kind of leave the hinging based stuff to a more maybe um, generalized glute adductor hamstring type thing with a little bit more of a comfortable knee bend. That's kind of where I lean. I just think that especially with free weights, like the counterbalance gets weird when your legs are straight. It's a little bit more difficult to execute overall. So would you agree in just in terms of a general experience? And then you use yourself the hyperextension and your some of your clients use it as well. Do you find that that's like a find to be a decent option for a lot of people, or is it kind of something that you maybe wouldn't go ahead and prescribe just off the bat to people?
No, it's been a huge asset. I mean, I think we've had that thing since maybe, I don't know, 2019 or so. And it really replaced all of my straight leg, like you mentioned, barbell and dumbbell hinging. I found it to be just a huge margin less, systemically fatiguing, and also a really big margin more in terms of like the local fatigue of the hamstrings and glutes, depending on how you set it up. And that's also been my experience, especially when it comes to coaching people, who have a resistance training background. It's not, super easy to just take someone who's never lifted before, put them on there on day one. But I don't think there's no one that I've coached, very few people that I've coached up to this point where it's just like, well, that's never going to be on the table. Like, I could never teach you to do it. Um, but that doesn't mean everyone gets it either. There are plenty of people that don't have it in their program, and plenty of people that, might have like a dumbbell variation, here or there. Um, but yeah, I've just found that particular machine to be, such a tremendous asset. And the only thing that I've ever used that I thought, wow, this could be, a potential, you know, replacement or something that I could use, you know, intermittently with it would be at Tom's gym. He had like the Nautilus hip extension, which is like a supine piece. You're on your back. It's got a seat belt, and it's got a pad, underneath your knees that you then, drive up into the seatbelt and hip extend either with, straight knee or bent knee. But there's like five of those on planet Earth, so I don't expect to come across that in any commercial gym. So yeah, to answer your question, I think like maybe coming in off the street and just going to, your average Gold's Gym or whatever. All of the hyperextensions are not created equal. Many of them start you in a position where you're significantly, tipped forward or more parallel to the ground versus, perpendicular to the ground. And maybe they don't have so much adjustability, whether that be like where the pad sits, in relation between your knee, and your belt line, or where the pad sits behind you in terms of like pressing into you know pressing into like your Achilles essentially. Those things can make a really big difference. And I have found, if I'm helping clients, remotely set up at their gyms, that we're not always successful in using like the hyperextensions that they have. So I realize like that is a limitation, for a lot of people. And I agree. I mean, you and I have had this conversation many times of like what exercises are necessary. Like we could have started today and said like, all right, but to build out a leg program, like, do we need leg extensions? Like, should we have something where we're in a hip flexed, position that we don't, move out of, and thus kind of like being able to lengthen and shorten, rec fem, and then again, some of the other benefits that might come with that, fixed position, such as like reduced, spine load. And we've gone back and forth a lot of times over just like, you know, getting to the basic conclusion of like, yeah, technically, like nothing is necessary, but our best guess is kind of where most people end up, where it's like, oh, you're probably going to do a leg extension movement. You're probably going to do some type of squat, leg press movement. If you only had, one hamstring movement, it's probably going to be a seated leg curl. If you had, two, maybe it's that and like a hinge. But if the hinge is, problematic from a pain standpoint, or just, it's not convenient based on the equipment, amount of weight, et cetera, that you have available, like, could you totally get away with just doing leg curls? Like, I don't think that's gonna, stop you from being quote unquote functional in the rest of your life.
Yep.
So, like the ability to hip hinge, like the neuromuscular like skill of doing it, like you can teach, an 80-year-old grandmother, with her body weight, like, how to pick something up, off of like a stool or whatever, right? You can teach her how to sit down on the toilet, and that involves, some hinging along, with knee bend as well. Like these are things that don't require you to necessarily like make them into weight room exercises in order for you to be, quote unquote functional in the year 2024. So I can't really say that like, if you don't do hip hinges, like that's going to increase your risk of injury. I think like on a net balance, if anything, like doing deadlifts, RDLs probably increase your risk of injury. If you just had to say like, what's more likely for a person to get injured if they avoid doing hip hinges or if they do a lot of loaded hip hinges? Like chances are you're more likely to get hurt doing the loaded hip hinges than not doing them at all. It'd be a really tough argument to make that
Yeah.
like just doing knee flexion, is going to be more, dangerous than, doing both of them together. But that doesn't mean that, the hip extension movements don't have their place in terms of like just rounding out the overall stimulus.
Yeah. And like you said, everything obviously operates in trade-offs. Like with any hinge, you'll obviously have, the addition of like spinal erector stuff and glute stuff and adductor stuff, at least the hip extension portion of the adductors. And then in any, leg curl, you'll have the addition of the gastroc, outer calf stuff. You'll have the addition of other knee flexors, sartorius, gracilis. You'll have less overall, spine load, less glutes, less, hamstring portion of the adductor. But I do think that those kinds of discrepancies end up kind of just working themselves out in a lot of ways in terms of just the imbalance of stimulus. Like you don't see someone that mostly does leg curls, just like you don't see their spine falling apart. You don't see the person who doesn't do leg curls having their hamstrings just fall apart or their knees fall apart. So I do think that there are definitely trade-offs, but I do think that I agree with that general notion of like, I personally have pretty much only acutely hurt my lower back doing hinge related activities, which is again not no fear mongering here or anything like that. You can certainly do them long term and be okay, but you just have to kind of be a little bit smarter about the way that you progress those and the way that you and just how sort of careful you are about maintaining technique and standardizing it as you increase in load and as you get stronger. So I think that's a decent place for hamstrings. I think it's fairly straightforward. The lying and the seated, pretty much in terms of me, I'm pretty much going to put them in most programs for muscle growth stuff. The stiff leg hinge is kind of a maybe, but something that is useful in a lot of cases, especially if someone has a hamstring specific goal. It's something worth considering for the reasons we talked about. And then maybe just last thing on that, in just terms of cueing, I think it's very useful to do a kind of straight-legged hinge that, like in a hyperextension, has some degree of restraint and stability, where you have a thigh pad and a pad on the back of the legs. But you can absolutely do hinges free weight with straighter knees. You just have to be cognizant about the range that you're using because, like we've said, a lot of people have a lot less range into that hinge as compared to one that has any degree of knee bend. So, just to kind of briefly cover glutes, one of the first things that I think about in terms of glutes is how I forget when this was, but you've told me on a number of occasions that, and obviously, of course, there's a genetic component to this, but you sort of accidentally, you sort of accidentally grew your glutes, just over the years, just doing heavy leg pressing, heavy squatting type stuff. Um, I certainly don't think that that implies that people shouldn't consider more specific alternatives, but I do think that a lot of like pro bodybuilders end up, that's the route that, you don't see a lot of pro bodybuilders like hip thrusting and doing kickbacks and those kinds of things. So, we kind of already covered the leg pressing stuff, which is obviously a glute heavy thing. If you do it with higher degrees of effort, if you want to optimize maybe for more hip there relative to knee, you might consider putting your feet a little bit higher. But like we mentioned, there's always going to kind of be a blend with higher efforts. Um, and then in terms of hinging kind of falls, into a similar category there that we talked about with the hamstring stuff. If you want to do more hingy stuff for glutes, you basically just have to do stuff that looks more like a squat and less like a hinge in some ways, just as long as you're kind of kicking your hips back. I think a really good example of a great place to start, like the hinging stuff for glutes, is something like a trap bar deadlift. I've had a lot of success with that personally, just coaching that because of just where the handles are and just the fact that people get a little bit more comfortable bending their knees. Any kind of hinge that is going to be pretty glutey is kind of just like a leg press that is done upright. And so, how you sort of operationalize the trade-off between hamstrings and glutes in a hinge is just the amount of knee bend that you have. So with any hinge that's more glutey, just kind of treat it more like it's a lower body press rather than this, separation of spine and lower limbs. Um, and then in terms of the short position stuff, the more squeeze position stuff, potentially you could consider a hip thrust, potentially you could consider a kickback, whether it's cable or machine. But I do find that those exercises, in terms of their popularity, I think are disproportionately looked at, disproportionately magnified in terms of their importance relative to all the other things we kind of just talked about. But is that kind of like your experience, and just with your own training and with some clients, is just like um, clients, especially women I've worked with, really have a clear picture of like, I need to do hip thrusts to grow my glutes. But I don't find that that's the case oftentimes in practice with people who end up, just doing this stuff for a long time. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to whether you're trying to grow your glutes relative to the rest of your leg, or whether you're just trying to grow them in an absolute sense. I think in an absolute sense, like I mentioned before, they, are going to be hit, you know, really well by things like squats, leg presses, your hinges. And it's probably not something, at least from a hypertrophy aspect, that you need to go out of your way to isolate. But, now with like the greater and greater popularity of like the bikini and figure and, just kind of where we are, I think socially with, Kim Kardashian and everything, it's like glutes are just popular, right? Like it's just something that is like desirable. But there was a time when glutes weren't desirable, when it was like skinny chicks and then, maybe big boobs. Like it all has its time and place, right? So I think we're just kind of like in an ass era. And it's like your ass looks bigger if your thighs are probably smaller too.
Yeah.
Probably not the best way to get the greater absolute ass size, but relatively, it might be a case for isolation work, which kind of backfires on itself too, because it's like that tends to also be the person who doesn't want to be in like a hypercaloric state. So, and also someone who's not very strong. So you end up in this state where you're doing like 100 sets a week, of glutes, and you can recover from 100 sets a week of isolation glutes because you're not that strong. And you're not really getting that much stronger because you're not eating more. So it's just kind of like this cycle. But at least on paper, like it makes sense that you might do something like a hip thrust or a kickback, if you had a reason to not want to grow your quads, and just grow your glutes instead. And again, as long as I'm just being like, misogynistic here, like I'm just gonna say like women in general, like, small thighs is not necessarily like something that we're prizing either. Like you can grow your thighs, it's fine. That's not guys, the guys that I'm training that are, have wandering eyes in the gym have never said to me like that girl's quads are too big, makes her ass look small.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I digress. So, maybe and maybe you can speak more to like when it comes to managing specific pain around like hips or even knees. Maybe there's a case for some isolation glute stuff, but maybe that's also too reductionist.
hmm Yeah, I definitely find that there's a case for, the kickbacks and the hip thrusts and the top portion of the hyperextension, isolating for that.
For the
Um,
abduction work as well. We talk about
yeah,
glutes like glute max, but all the other
yeah,
the ass area.
yeah. It's just kind of like in the context of training, like what would be full hip extension. By definition, you can really only train full hip extension in a relatively less stable environment, so whether it's a kickback, it has to be single leg if it's full hip extension. So whether it's a kickback on a machine, which is obviously better or more stable rather, not better than something like a cable kickback, but just as you sort of alluded to, a lot of the single leg cable motions just end up being dumpster fires of like zero load, no stability. The opposite side standing leg is fatiguing, right? It's just like there's so many things to manage that nothing ends up getting done productively. I do think that there's for sure a case of just like, you know, for example, and everyone likes to shit on bird dogs these days, but like I think training just the short position of the glutes in something like a bird dog can sort of check the box of like just maintaining some degree of contraction quality in that end range hip extended position. I don't even necessarily think it needs to be something that you load substantially. Um, and at the end of the day, too, I think there's always a place for the hip thrusts and the hyperextension stuff. I just generally find that when I present information, I usually am basing it. The way I present it is usually based off of what people are currently prioritizing, maybe too much. So this is kind of maybe just to reel some of that back into the real world and how actual people train and make progress, which is mostly with those kinds of bread and butter lower body pressing motions. Um, but I think just orthopedically, just to respond to what you said directly, um, you could certainly make a case for the abduction adduction machine being something that's very useful. You use that machine. I use it whenever I have access to it, and I would advise people to do it. I think it's important to train different planes of motion, different muscles as a consequence, and to just make sure that, like, especially as you age, you're not just completely ignoring contraction of a certain group or contraction in a specific direction entirely. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do it in its full range. It doesn't mean it has to be uh, super heavily loaded. Doesn't mean that you have to do it as frequently as you train other groups. But as long as you just at some point during the week or at some point in some mesocycle, you have a selection for those kinds of less prioritized motions. I think that's something that's definitely worth considering, especially as you get bigger and bigger. It's just to sort of maintain those quote secondary tissues or what ends up being the secondary tissues, the stabilizer tissues for a lot of your other kinds of motions.
And is
And
that, earlier we might sound like we're contradicting ourselves. Earlier, we're like, hey, ideally your program is rounded out, with a straight knee hip extension motion, but it's not the end of the world if you can't do that. How might that differ from what we're talking about here as far as, training different like planes of motion or maybe muscles that, aren't going through as much length change?
yeah, yeah. So that's a good point. So the point of comparison that with that example is the first one is kind of like, okay, if you're not totally keen on doing like straight knee hinges and they're not super comfortable, you can kind of just get away with maybe doing some lying leg curls, some seated leg curls, assuming the rest of like your hip related training is sort of like leg pressy stuff that we talked about, basic hinges. Um, you know, in the case of removing the straight legged hinge, you're not removing hamstring training, from your program. You're either doing it in the context of a leg curl or sort of combined in something like, a sort of hinge that's in the middle of a totally straight knee or a totally, more squatty type motion. But in the context of removing something like training full hip extension or removing training the abduction adduction machine, it's like you're neglecting entire groups and subsections of muscles that would otherwise not ever directly get trained, right? Like obviously you're walking around all the time, those tissues have to be to some degree contracting on a regular basis, but if you never implement any of that abduction adduction work, you are missing an entire bucket of training qualities of training specific tissues. Whereas if you remove the straight legged hinge, you still have the hamstring work that you're getting from the seated leg curl and the lying leg curl. So even though fundamentally the motion is coming from somewhere different, the sort of takeaway is like what things am I asking to contract in this exercise and how much overlap in that contraction is there between that one and all the other ones that I'm doing, you know? So if you remove the seated leg curl and the lying leg curl, then I would say, you know, do something for hamstrings more specifically. But if you have those other things in there and you're training those qualities, despite the fact that, you know, you're moving through the knee and not the hip, I think that's okay. But in the context of the hip related stuff, I definitely would advise, at least on a semi-regular basis, um, training those lateral and those medial hip muscles, the abductors and the adductors, in a little bit more of a direct way, even if it's unstable, just sort of checking that box to some degree to make sure that you don't sort of lose competency in that area as other tissues improve their ability to contract and as other tissues get bigger.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe also that when people think of those machines, they think of, oh, my adductors and my glutes, but you just said I'm working my glutes on a leg press and I'm working my adductors, as well. So why do I need to do that? And maybe it's just not realizing like, well, that there's a whole lot of stuff, under those butt cheeks. Like there's lots of different fiber, directions, different muscles, like depending on whether you're, hip flexed or hip extended, that can change the bias. And there's, not just one muscle, pulling your legs together.
Yeah.
So it's just simply like, you know, how much are we sort of like biasing certain tissues over other ones? And if all we're doing to train the glutes is maybe just that hip extension component sort of in a mid-range, at least as far as like the loading goes, that maybe, training them more through a greater range or training tissues that, um, are sort of running in slightly different directions might be a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the big takeaway there that can be applied, I think, to just at a principle based level is that uh, when you read about a muscle's contraction in a textbook, like take a great example is like piriformis. You know, in a textbook, a piriformis is a hip external rotator, but the textbook doesn't tell you that in 90 degrees of hip flexion, piriformis is what you could consider, you know, a primary abductor of the hip, which is actually in terms of like its most powerful function, it has a larger moment for hip abduction in that position relative to the moment that it has in hip external rotation. So without getting like, you know, super jargony and sort of off track, that's just one example of many that you could also apply to the whole adductor group, right? Like in a leg press, you're certainly going to primarily be training that adductor magnus, but you won't be training the adductor longus. You won't be training the adductor brevis, the pectineus, any of those guys to the same relative degree that you would that adductor magnus. So finding a space to be able to give some of those other muscles a little bit of love, I think is important, but it doesn't need to be, you know, you don't need to carve out, you know, a whole hour session to do that. It could literally be like, you could consider it a warm up for your other, you know, exercise. That's a great place. I think that it fits in. Um, and last bit on that before we finish off here with calves is, if you're going to train, you know, it's just one of those somewhat unrealistic question way to like frame a question, but if it was like, oh, are you only going to train abduction, adduction in this position or in this position? I would say the most practically applicable way to train them would be in a position that's more hip extended, meaning that's like in a position where like if you're just standing up and you're doing a kick out or something that's like your leg pulling inward, that's probably the most relevant to, you know, what we call daily life if you want to go there, or that's probably the most relevant in the context of training to the kinds of motions that you're neglecting with your other sorts of patterns. That can be very tricky to do unless you have, you know, an adduction machine that really reclines all the way back. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is like you only have a cable, but even something like a cable or something like a body weight motion, it can be an alternative. So some stuff that you've played around with, I know, is the Copenhagen plank. That's not a terrible option for people to play around with for the adduction based thing. And then just sort of the opposite of that, you know, maybe where you put your knees on top of a bench could be the abduction version of that, or just simply lying on your side, you know, and just doing abductions like lying that way. I see nothing super problematic about that, especially because as you get more advanced, the weight of your leg, you know, becomes heavier and heavier. So it's kind of like that story of the guy, you know, that old fable or whatever, however you say it.
Milo, the bull.
Yeah, he's carrying, and the bull is getting heavier as he's walking. It's kind of the same situation with you. Um, you were gonna
And
say
that,
something?
it's funny, like you mentioned with the big three, the bird dog being one, and then the side plank or modified side plank being another one. So it's like you have
Yep.
the hip extension, but then you also have the hip abduction, from a more hip extended position as well there.
Yeah.
I would also say, just anecdotally, you talk to people like the late and great John Meadows, and people who've been training for 20, 30, 40 years. It's very common for those guys to recommend, like, start your quad session, your leg session, with adduction, abduction, and leg curls, and it
Yeah.
feels great every time. So just that's how I start my sort of, if you could even call it, the sort of quad bias day, but the day where I'm doing leg extensions, leg presses, hack squats. The first exercise, the order that I go in is I do my calf raise first, because that's something that used to be more of a weakness, but it's just not that systemically fatiguing. And I'm doing it still like an hour before I end up getting into my hack squats and everything anyway. So very first thing I do, and then I'm abduction, adduction, standing leg curl or lying leg curl, and then I begin, the quad session, and
Yeah.
that's worked for a long time and feels great for a lot of people.
And I think it's just to dovetail off of that one example, like John's sort of philosophy on that and what has ended up being a lot of people's strategy, whether knowingly or unknowingly, is like those are all the muscles that contribute secondarily, but not primarily to a lower body press. So it's like hamstrings, adductors, abductors. Those are the guys that, at least the single, the non-adductor magnus adductors. Those are the guys that really hold your hips together as you do that motion. So it does kind of end up making a lot of sense, at least working backward from that point. Okay, calves. Oh, and just for context, I really end up, my bias, as you know, is heavily like biomechanics, look at the mechanics thing. I do find that the one group that I'm really like, if I'm ever anti biomechanics, it's probably with the glute stuff. Just because it's like the longer time that's gone by, the more that I see people going the direction of like trying to be super nerdy about glute training, the worse I see people's glute training become. So, in 2024, we can bring back not being so hyper specific about about glute training. Like if
Yeah,
you ask Chris Bumstead, Chris, how'd you get those striated glutes? He'd be like, leg press, leg press,
guys
squats.
that don't start doing glute. I mean, most like pro bodybuilders still don't really do glute training aside from a little bit of abduction. Like literally the way we described it is what the bros are doing. Like maybe a little bit of hip abduction here, maybe a little bit of hip extension there. But the guys with the best glutes in the world, are going to be pro bodybuilders, do not do glute training. It's the way that, other people doing it. So,
Yeah.
you know, for what that anecdote's worth over the last, 70 plus years of bodybuilding, um, you know, take it for what it's worth.
Yeah, and if you also ask the simple question of what category of athlete by far and away has the best on average developed glutes, I would say sprinters, bodybuilders aside. And like, what is a sprint other than a high velocity leg press? Like, it's just like legs in front, sagittal plane, kick away, kick away. Obviously, selection bias there. I get it, whatever. People with big glutes get into sprinting, but there's clearly a pattern. Okay. So we kind of lumped in abductors, adductors there. That was good. And we finished off with the shank, which is
It just made me hungry, actually. That's funny. Like, because I'm starting to get into, we're a couple hours shy of our Saturday date night.
yeah.
And as you said Shank, I was like, I wonder what I'm going to do for dinner tonight.
What
We
a
can see,
weird transition.
we can see by the tan, we're getting closer.
Of course, yeah. Yeah. That'll be funny because I'll like screenshot you. I'll screenshot you like every week and it'll just put out like a post of like Ethan's podcast from, 10 weeks out to 1 week out or whatever.
I was looking
Um,
at pictures from 21 to now 11. It's like you don't really see it until you look back, but good. We're
yeah. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited. I'm more excited than I let off. But anyway, shank. Shank is a technical term for the space between the ankle and the knee. Um, and that really includes your calves, so your gastroc, medial lateral, soleus, and then all the stuff on the front side of the shin. People only give love to the tibialis anterior, but we have extensor digitorum. We have all the different smaller extensors, the brevis, the ones that extend the big toe. Like those guys are, they deserve love too. But that's pretty much just, what people call a tibialis raise. If you don't have access to that, use a cable. If you don't have access to a cable, load a dumbbell on your foot, you'll be fine. It doesn't
Would you
require.
do you recommend that? Like if you're designing a program, like you said, it's your preference to have abduction, adduction. If they don't have that, you might have them do, some type of side plank, Copenhagen dealio. Like if a person has the goal of maximizing body composition, building muscle mass, and they're doing calf raises, like is it pretty ubiquitous that you're going to have them do like a dorsiflexion, tib raise kind of thing?
Yeah, so I always try to, and whether or not people end up doing this is a different question, because if you don't have a machine, it's pretty annoying. I will always put like 2 or 3 sets in there a week for those people. But I think that the scale of that in terms of its importance magnifies in two cases. The first case is if someone has very specific calf related goals, which a lot of people do. Um, I know I did and still kind of do. If you're doing like 15 sets of calves a week, it's probably likely that you should train the antagonist motion. I think that's one case for it. And then the other big case is just age. The more that you age, things like dorsiflexion and the joints that are more load bearing are the things that are liable to deteriorate a little bit more rapidly. So if you're older, if you're dealing with an older population, that in terms of its importance is going to scale. And that's also something that in the context of other motion scales, so if you're coaching someone through a leg press, you want their ankle not to be a rate limiter as much as it shouldn't be. So older populations and people with high calf volume priority, not a huge deal. I mentioned my cousin on last week's podcast. He asked me about like, should I be doing like the tib thing? Because like everyone through Chris Bumstead is now just discovering the tibialis raise, um, because he started doing it last prep or whatever, and so now it's a thing in the popular space. In that case, I wouldn't say it's a priority, but as I mentioned, I think just in terms of general function, it's not something that directly gets trained through a lot of other, work that we consider direct for other groups. So yeah, I would say that. Um, Before we get to calves, which are not super complicated, it's important to point out that your gastroc, the outer calf, crosses the knee. So if you're not doing calf raises, you're still training that guy. If you're doing leg curls or any, prone or seated, especially toward that more knee straight position. So that's something that is overlapping that's worth considering. But in terms of calves, it's just like straight knee calf raise, whether it's on a leg press or a straight knee calf machine or a standing calf raise. Those are great um, in general. And then seated calf raise for the more knee bent position. I would say that interestingly, uh, it has been recently asserted that the standing calf raise, as with all of this other length and partial mumbo jumbo that we're currently working through as an industry, people seem to be prioritizing the straight knee calf raise. But I would say in most cases that the straight knee calf raise ends up being a lot more difficult to stabilize and anchor. In the seated calf raise, you have a very direct support. You're seated. You have a pad on your knees, so undoubtedly output will be higher just per unit of contraction. And I think that in terms of what to prioritize from a calf standpoint, you could make the argument that a more knee straight position allows for more range at the ankle, which in terms of the conversation we just had, maybe something to prioritize in an older population or a population where you're just working on ankle range stuff. You're going to have some extra room to dorsiflex, plantar flex in that case. So aside from that, anything on a general level that you would say about calves or more specifically about the seated versus straight knee that you want to mention?
Just to clarify what you just said,
Yeah.
uh, you said the knee extended straight leg calf raise is something you prioritize in the older population.
Sorry, the knee flexed. So the seated calf raise would be the priority in the older.
That's what I thought you.
Yeah. Um, yeah, oopsie. Um, so yeah, so other than that, technically speaking, you could make the argument that the straight knee calf will stretch the outer calf more, which could potentially be beneficial. But what I have found is that, and this is kind of part and parcel of the study that looked at seated calf or standing calf, and unanimously people were like, we should only do, the straight knee calf because there was more growth. But what you don't really consider is the discrepancy in terms of the range that you're using with a straight knee calf. You have a lot less range into dorsiflexion, meaning like you have a lot less range into being able to pull your toe to your eyes. And so what ends up happening is the straight knee calf raise, just by definition, is just a calf raise partial, essentially compared to the straight knee or the bent knee one. So you end up just in the seated calf raise, a lot of times you end up using a load that is only challenging for the shorter position of that motion. Whereas in the standing, you end up using a load that's appropriate for the bottom portion of the motion. So you end up just using more load, like doing more reps with the same load in the standing variation, but that doesn't mean that the standing variation is just better, right? It's just like you're starting from a point where you're in a stronger position, you can lift more load, create more tension, and all those things. So I would just do both. Seems unreasonable not to do both if you're at any normal gym. Um, and in terms of maybe just pointers before I hand it back to you, I would say that a focus less on the foot and more on the heel is something that has been really helpful for me and a lot of people that have seemed to struggle with this stuff is just feeling a lot of foot stuff tends to kind of be a limiter for people just in terms of feeling weird stuff in their toes or up through their shins. So again, just kind of harkening back to that concept of like finding that middle range groove and just sort of moving through the heel, imagining like pulling the heel up and pulling it down, I find to be helpful. Is that something that you still kind of, focus on or recommend or anything else in terms of like execution intent?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll often cue like drive your heel over, kind of in an arcing motion, like drive your heel over your toes, your ankle over your toes, rather than just focusing on, a lot of people, like you said, will kind of grip the foot plate and end up feeling a lot more, foot stuff than they do calf. And my favorite calf raise to use as far as the knee extended version is something that's more of like a rotary or kind of arcing calf raise where I start off basically pushing horizontally and then I finish almost pushing downwards. And I think that really emphasizes that concept that you're talking about of that heel kind of arcing up and over. You get some of that experience too on calf raises that have more of like a rounded foot plate to them. So anytime you get the opportunity to sort of, much like the other exercises, some of the other exercises we talk about, imagine that arc that basically like your heel is moving through as you do the calf raise. And that you might be moving more vertically at one point and then moving more horizontally at another point. I think is useful to sort of imagine your mind. So I've had you know, really good sort of sensation and output using the rotary calf raise, like in a Cybex again, where it's loaded at the low back and hips, like the leg press we were talking about before. And then yeah, I also think if you have something that isn't set up that way, maybe it's more of like a flat foot plate, or maybe your leg press just doesn't really allow you to get into the short position particularly well for the knee extended version. I really like just length and partials there. So I use the seated calf raise as you mentioned. to really accentuate more of the short position. And it just so happens we have a really good seated calf raise where I can also, get relatively lengthened, at least, as far as motion at the ankle goes and with the soleus. Um, but, if I didn't have that rotary calf raise, like on my, my second calf day where I'm just doing the seated calf raise and the leg press calf raise, I only do the lengthened partials, for the knee extended leg press calf raise because I'm just going to get considerably more output there versus trying my best to get into a short position, which dramatically decreases the load I can use. I've had really really good results with my calves over the last couple of years. I would say anecdotally on this front, what you hear from the bros is generally like really really high volume, really really just like high amounts of overall stress placed on the calves relative to other body parts, and that may simply just be because like of the low systemic fatigue you get from them. um People will say, well, we walk on them all day and, kind of give reasoning like that. But it's very common and to hear recommendations that range from like crazy high reps and short rest periods all the way to super heavy reps and longer rest periods. um, it was like Arnold was famous for being like, oh, I went and trained with Reg Park and South Africa and did 1,000 pound standing calf raises, and then I, because he used to take pictures like standing in like almost knee height water, so he didn't have to show his calves. Uh, and his whole thing was he trained them super heavy, but lots of other people are like, no, we just train calves with high reps and we, do 50 rep sets and drop sets. And I think the general, thought process there is they can just like, take a real beating either with frequency or volume. Um, but as a counter to that, honestly, like what I found with all of my training in general is that just like as you get more efficient with exercise selection, setup, and execution, that you can really create a tremendous amount of output with far fewer sets. So I have in the past absolutely tried like training calves every day and doing super high rep sets and occlusion and heavy load and all sorts of weird shit. Um, and I did find when I gained a ton of weight, like 50 pounds in a few years, like they got a little bit bigger that way as well. But I think, you know, more than anything, my bias just leans towards when people aren't growing something more often than not, it's because of the way, the exercises they're choosing, how they're setting them up, and how they're executing them. So I think most things are still going to follow that principle. And some things just maybe lean more towards that than others or need higher volume than others simply because the exercises we have available oftentimes just don't optimize for that. So
Mhm.
whether it's the profile of like, a back exercise, like a row or a pull down, or maybe we don't, get quite as much, output as we could with a well set up machine, or whether it be, a calf raise where you're only moving through a small part of that range and maybe you're kind of bouncing out of it. Like in those cases, maybe it does require a tremendous amount of volume to get the same stimulus. But, if you can really, optimize for those three things I mentioned, I think most of the time you can do far less.
Yeah. And so what I took away from that was since you met me, yeah, your calves have exploded in hypertrophy. Is that is that,
I mean, at least from a correlation perspective, I can't.
Yeah, yeah. No, you know me as the calf master for sure. So no, but I do find just sort of last takeaway from that was like I do find a massive difference in the load I'm able to use between doing a full range seated calf raise and just a sort of bottom half seated calf raise. And that for me has sort of been an addition in the last, year or so of just I almost treat like the first, if I'm doing like 4 or 5 sets of seated calf, I'll do like the first 1 or 2 with the full range, and then I'll do the last like 3, in just in the bottom half. And the difference in load and reps is just like crazy in my experience. And I also end up feeling a lot just anecdotally with that bottom half. I end up feeling a lot more gastroc fatigue relative to like soleus fatigue. just sort of, scaling the load and dropping the range to that bottom portion. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to elucidate with the seated versus standing calf study, which is if you do a full range version of each of those, you end up doing a shortened partial basically for the seated calf, and you end up doing a lengthened partial for the standing calf. But I think it's probably just beneficial to do, train the full range of each of those, and then also include sets where, you're prioritizing one end of the range, or, the bottom end of the range over just the top half. Um, so yeah, and I also think that to your point about just you gaining weight, a lot of people sometimes, like if I ever post about calf stuff, people love to kind of, make funny quips about their own experience. Well, they'll say like, yeah, I used to be super overweight. And so I've always had massive calves, and that's something that I've in a kind of serious way I have found has been consistent. Is just like people who used to weigh, a lot more than maybe they should from a health standpoint. Just in terms of like body fat percentage, when they drop down in weight, a lot of times their calves end up being bigger, or just the people who, walk on their toes naturally, their calves end up being bigger relative to the average person. Dancers, like Audrey has always had well developed calves. She's always doing the whole plantar flexion thing, and I've gotten some heat for that. Just how well developed her calves are relative to mine. Whatever. It's a body fat thing. Anyway, so the only thing we didn't talk about, which just like the hip flexor stuff, which is just like, I don't know, you and I have kind of gone through different phases of like focusing on that, not focusing on it as much. I personally think that it kind of falls under the category of like, this is a muscle group that, like the upper traps, for example, it's like there's no way not to load, your primary hip flexors and pretty much any lower body motion. You could make the argument that if you're in an instance where you're addressing a rehab situation, or you're addressing a range of motion situation, if you've somehow determined that there was a pathology and that's something you're looking to improve, training hip flexion directly, totally fine, especially for people who maybe are those that perceive themselves to sort of be those chronically like locked up people. Not a bad idea to train hip flexion directly, but that is one of those things that I don't tend to like prioritize in a program, just because there's no real way to get rid of them, especially from a lumbar spine standpoint. It's kind of like trying to isolate your diaphragm, in any sort of exercise. It's like it's just working all day. It's never shutting off. So I don't find that it's usually necessary, but in those exceptional cases, I do find that some of that stuff can be helpful just from a general hip function standpoint. So, anything that you kind of want to finish out with in terms of maybe just things we didn't touch on, or things that you'd like to add to anywhere? I think that was pretty comprehensive, but if you have any final notes, let them rip.
No, man, thought that was good. Time for the last posing session of the day and date night.
All right.